getting worse, John. There used to be quite rigid ones that you can never get comfortable with.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming this evening. In our moment, I'll hand you over to Anthony Loyd, who is the Times roving correspondent, who's going to be chairing tonight's discussion with Jonathan Powell. Before I do that, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we're broadcasting live this evening. And if there's anybody at the back, there's a whole row of seats down here at the front, so please come and take them. And so I'll hand over to Anthony.
Should I wait a minute or so? Well, how lovely to see such a full room tonight, and thank you all so much for coming. There seem few better or worse times, perhaps, than to be talking about whether we should talk to terrorists. Only today we hear that one of the killers of Lee Rigby discussed in some detail on Facebook killing a British soldier a few months before his crime. Yesterday, Theresa May told us that the terrorist threat to the UK had never been higher. And only 2 weeks ago, a think tank report, the Institute for Economy and Peace, published its figures for 2013 that found out that fatalities due to terrorist attacks were at the highest level ever. Some 18,000 people, principally in 5 countries, had died in terrorist violence in 2013. The same report warned that the figures for this year would be higher still, and also noted a sharp incline in terrorist attacks since the killing of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad. So what do we do about terrorists? Do we kill them, cage them, or do we speak to them as a way to get ourselves out of this mess? Our guest tonight needs very little introduction to you all. Jonathan Powell was Chief of Staff to Downing Street during the entire tenure of Tony Blair's time as Prime Minister. More to the point, he was Chief Negotiator with Sinn Féin in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement, and in December 1997 met in the same cabinet room with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness as Lloyd George had met with de Valera in 1921, just before Christmas, while the Christmas tree was removed from the door of number 10 at Campbell's Word so that terrorists couldn't be photographed with tinsel. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Inevitably, we want to go on and talk about Islamic State and whether we should talk to them at some point. But before we get there, I think there's quite a lot of things to ask and discuss about talking with terrorists, the morality and the practicalities of it. Jonathan, how do you define terrorists? Is it a useful term? Is it one you use?
Well, it's certainly not very helpful on the book at the moment because I run a small charity that works on conflict between armed groups and governments. And the people I want to give copies of it to are the terrorists, and they don't really fancy it. So I need to cover the front of the book up when I give it to people. And no, I don't think it's a very useful term. As I say in the introduction to the book, the trouble with terror is that it is a tactic. It could be used by governments, it can be used by individuals, and it can be used by armed groups. And it doesn't define what they do. So the real title of the book should be Talking to Non-State Armed Groups Who Use Terror as a Device Against Members of the Public with Real Political Support. But that wouldn't fit on the cover, so we couldn't do that.
In your experience, do some terrorists recognise that they are terrorists, or do they always have a sort of buyout clause in their own mind?
No, they don't recognise that they're terrorists. I haven't ever come across someone who says, hello, I'm a terrorist. They're all regard themselves, and people like Nelson Mandela, who was accused of being a terrorist, and people like Yasser Arafat, make a big point of the fact that they were called terrorists, and the same people later greet them as statesmen. So they're conscious that they're being called terrorists, but mainly people use the word terrorist in order to, as a pejorative term, to try and make the people unacceptable as people to talk to. That is the objective of it. For example, the Americans made the Maoists in Nepal terrorists. They listed them as terrorists, meant they couldn't talk to them, but didn't stop them winning the election. And once they became the government, of course, they had to talk to them, terrorists or no terrorists.
But in your own mind, how do you define terrorist? If I, for example, am planning to plant a bomb in a bar that will kill civilian people in order to promote a message or gain some political leverage, I am a terrorist. Is that how you see it, or do you have the definition of terrorist in your own mind? If not, if it's not one you actually use.
Yeah, I mean, governments have struggled to come to a definition of terrorism. The United Nations has passed a convention against terrorism, but can't ever agree what terrorism is. And certainly, President Assad's definition of a terrorist would be very different from ours. But for me, I think there is a definition, an expression that people use. And the use of terror is against civilians. When you blow up people who have nothing to do with the combat, who you shoot them, you assassinate them in order to get a message across. So I think, although I say it's not a very useful term to define groups, what terror is perfectly clear to me.
Would someone like Jerry Adams be horrified to think that some people bracketed him with Islamic State?
Yes, they would certainly, Sinn Féin and the former members of the IRA would go a very long way to distance themselves from later terrorists. I don't think Menachem Begin would want to be thought of in the same breath as the PLO, let alone Hamas. And yet all three were called terrorists, and all three did commit acts of terror in their time. This is my point, is that we always call them terrorists when we first meet them, then we make peace with them, and then we call them statesmen.
And Menachem Begin's group did hang, I believe, 2 British sergeants.
Yeah, it was a rather horrible, grisly crime, a bit like the 2 corporals who were dealt with by the IRA when they mistakenly ended up in Milltown Cemetery in West Belfast. It was a very sort of symbolic similarity, although they booby-trapped the body of one of them that blew up the people who came to cut them down.
Why do you think we should talk to terrorists? There are plenty of examples in recent history, whether it's Sri Lanka, whether it's Peru, or whether it's Chechnya. In the second war, I agree there's a difference in perspective on different people's view on terrorists, but where terrorist campaigns have been ended, decapitated, annihilated by counter-terrorist operations without any need for recourse to talks.
Well, I'm afraid it's going to be a rather long answer to that, because there aren't many examples of it. The point of doing this book was to look back over the last 30 years, look at the various conflicts, at the negotiations that tried to end them, and those that succeeded and those that failed. And academics have lots of different categories for how terrorism ends, but if you look at it and you're looking only at these big groups, the groups that have real political support, I don't think the other categories other than talking really work. If you take Chechnya, it is true that a dictatorship can deal with an insurgency any way it wants. Stalin very successfully dealt with any chance of insurgency. The trouble is that they do it in a way that we could never manage in a Western democracy, and the trouble is that it comes back again. Hafez Assad thought he had dealt with the problem by killing 15 to 20,000 people in one go, but actually the problem came back again for his son. So dictators can use...
Do you think that was the same problem?
It wasn't exactly the same, but he certainly hadn't solved his problem. The problem was still there with the Brotherhood and with the other groups that he was trying to deal with at the time. He hadn't solved the problem. It continued to be there, despite the massacre. So it is true that totalitarian regimes can close down a terrorist movement in a way that we could not. But generally speaking, it comes back again as it came back with the end of the Soviet Union. As the ice melted, all these groups reappeared again. They hadn't actually been solved by Stalin or his successors. The second method that academics talk about is decapitation, of actually removing the leader of a terrorist group. And
as with the Shining Path in Peru?
Well, that's the point. That if decapitation worked, how come it didn't work with the PKK? They got Öcalan, they put him in jail, the PKK violence went down for a while, but it went back again and exceeded what had happened before. So removing Öcalan certainly didn't deal with the problem. In the case of Hamas, killing Sheikh Hasina didn't finish off the problem, it actually made it worse. So decapitation clearly doesn't work in every case. In the case of Shining Path, it certainly, and I write about this in the book, it did clearly have an effect, because Comrade Gonzalo was a pretty weird sort of guy, and he was more like a religious cult than a normal terrorist movement. He built the whole thing around himself, and so when he was arrested and humiliated in his cage, and most of the leadership went with him, it did reduce dramatically the Shining Path problem. There are still 2 groups of Shining Path fighting in Peru, so the problem didn't go away entirely, but it went down dramatically. But again, the real way that Shining Path was dealt with was by the means that ended up with President Fujimori being in jail. They used methods, I mean, if you look at the deaths in the fight against Shining Path, at least half of them were due to the army and the paramilitary groups that were used to fight Shining Path. So again, they were using methods to close it down that we could not use in Western democracies, which then takes us to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is touted, particularly by the Rajapaksas, as an example of how you can deal with terrorism simply by military means. And it is true, they fought a very effective military campaign. But if you look at it in detail, it's very hard to believe that it's generally applicable. If you talk to Erik Solheim, who was the Norwegian negotiator with the Tamil Tigers, who spent years building up a relationship with them, years on the negotiation, he says that if Prabhu Khan had remained the military genius everyone had thought he was, he would not have been defeated. By opting for a conventional military campaign against a conventional army, he was destined to lose. Had he stayed fighting a guerrilla campaign, he'd still be in the jungle now. He would not have been defeated. So you can't guarantee that a guerrilla leader is going to turn from a military genius into a military fool. Nor, again, could we use the tactics that were used around the Nandikal Lagoon to finish off the Tigers with the huge death of civilians. Again, that would not be a method we could use in West Belfast with any very clear conscience to finish a terrorist movement. And thirdly, the problem of the Tamils is not solved, as we've seen in the recent election, as we've seen in the unrest in Tamil Nadu in neighbouring India. The political problem at the root of it is still there. Thank God there is no more terrorism at the moment, but it's very hard to believe you won't have it again unless someone addresses the political campaign. So that's a long answer to say, if you look in detail at the vaunted examples of how you can end it without talking, if you're talking about these big groups, it's very hard to see successful examples we could emulate.
But in the short term, if you are a dictatorship, you can perhaps crush or contain a terrorist movement if you're prepared to kill or imprison enough people.
Yeah, and we, the British imperial power in the 19th century, did so very successfully too. When we were, there's a rather wonderful book by Sir Christopher Caldwell, I think it's called, about fighting insurgencies in Upper Burma and places like that. The methods we were prepared to use were, of course, successful. But the point about terrorism I'm trying to make is it is, in a way, the evil twin of democracy, because we're not prepared to use the methods that dictatorships would use, or 19th century imperial governments would use. We can't beat them in that way, and therefore we have to find another way.
You say that almost all conflicts have some sort of solution. But do you therefore derive from that we should speak to all terrorist groups? I noticed in your book you say that some of them, like the Baader-Meinhof group or the Red Brigade, are small, middle class and have no real political basis, therefore they're not worth speaking to because they can be wrapped up by police work. Do you extend that definition to limit some of the other groups we should speak to, or do you think that generally, how do you define who we should speak to and who we shouldn't?
But that's the point about terrorism or terrorists not being a particularly useful definition. If you lump together something like the Symbionese Liberation Army with the IRA or the FMLN in El Salvador, you're not really talking about the same sort of group.
This was Patty
Hearst group, or Baader-Meinhof, or Red Army Faction, or the Brigati Rossi, or any of these other groups. They simply do not have major political support. I mean, the reason in the end we were talking to Sinn Féin was not just that they had guns, it was also they had at least a third of the Catholic vote during most of the time of the Troubles. They had genuine political support. So I've also suggested we should not, for example, necessarily talk to the dissident IRA. They do not have political support. They are able to still kill people, but I do not see the need to talk to them in the way that you would need to talk to a major armed movement with major political support. That's the distinction I draw.
So why the government amnesia then? Why does the British government particularly say we don't talk to terrorists when it seems to have ended up talking to terrorists one way or another so many times over the past 30, 40 years?
Well, it's not just the British government, all governments do it. It's interesting, if you look, the American government, Turkish government, all governments say we will never talk to terrorists and then end up talking to terrorists. I mean, there are a number of reasons for that. The most important is in a democracy, it's very hard to justify to your people talking to a terrorist movement that are killing your innocent civilians. How on earth would you explain that you're talking to them? Think of John Major, who went before Parliament and said that it would turn his stomach to talk to Gerry Adams. He would never do it. And yet at the very same time he was corresponding with Martin McGuinness that very same week. He was sending letters to Martin McGuinness, and thank goodness he was, because if he hadn't had that secret correspondence, we wouldn't have been able to get to a peace settlement. He wouldn't have had the Downing Street Declaration. So governments do this. I mean, it's not just, again, British governments. The Spanish government, every Spanish Prime Minister since Franco has said they will never talk to ETA. And so far, every single Prime Minister has talked to ETA, despite that. And they always lie about it to Parliament. Suarez, the first Prime Minister after Franco, went to Parliament and said he was not talking, in response to a question from the leader of the opposition, Felipe González, said he was not talking to ETA. And González got up again and said, but you told me over dinner last night you were talking to ETA. And he still denied it.
Secrecy, then, is always essential when it comes to democracies talking to terrorists, or always desirable?
It certainly is when governments start off. Again, if you look at the pattern of these negotiations, of these conflicts I've looked at, all of them start deniably or secretly because governments simply can't face up to the consequences of doing it publicly. Usually that's in order to get to a ceasefire so that conversations can take place not against the background of outrages but at least of quiet. Otherwise, outrages knock things off course. I mean, in Colombia in the last week, where talks have been going on without a ceasefire, a general was kidnapped in Choco province, taken by the FARC, and the president pulled the negotiating panel away from the Havana table. He didn't send them back to Havana, and the talks were stalled. Luckily, the FARC have announced they're going to release the general, so the talks will be able to continue. But that's the sort of problem you run into if you had talks without a ceasefire. That's why government starts secretly.
By talking to them, though, on this straight-up moral issue, by allowing a gun at the place of the democratic process, don't you give them a legitimacy they don't deserve?
Well, it's certainly true that terrorist groups crave legitimacy. It's the one thing that they really want. And so you are rewarding them to that extent. I would argue that you're giving them a fairly temporary legitimacy, and that is a price worth paying for a negotiation. Again, if you take the FARC, they definitely got legitimacy from talking to the government in Colombia from 1999 to 2002. There's no doubt they got, again, legitimacy. They had a huge amount of publicity. But when they broke off the negotiations, when it was clear they weren't at all serious about negotiating, they actually lost even more legitimacy than they'd had before, and they were dismissed as narco-terrorists thereafter. So I think it is worth the temporary price of legitimacy to get to a negotiation, get to negotiated peace, because it is only temporary. It will fall away if they go back to fighting.
What about those groups who don't have much political foundation or support, though? Do you believe that they would be worth speaking to because, for example, they become entrenched or because they become frighteningly powerful?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily be against engaging with armed groups, small fractional armed groups, if it was useful, but that would be largely useful for tactical reasons. So, for example, people have talked to the dissident IRA in prison, and that is worth doing to see if you can discourage them. But what you're not going to have is a full political negotiation of the sort you'd have with the ANC or the GAM in Indonesia. Those groups that have real political support, because in the end you need to negotiate with them politically and address the political question at the root of it.
Did you feel at any time, talking with Gerry Adams or McGuinness, that in fact it wasn't about being smart and about being clever? It was about being ruthless and slightly unprincipled, going over the heads of non-violent political groups in order to speak to the men with guns to make things work?
There is always a difficult moral line to walk. What you don't want to find yourself doing is negotiating under the threat of violence. You don't want to negotiate with violence going on, but nor do you want to be making concessions under the threat of violence, nor do you want to, on the other hand, tip terrorist movement back into violence unintentionally, as John Major did with Canary Wharf, where the IRA ceased to believe that he was serious about engaging them in negotiations because he kept stringing them out and wasn't politically strong enough to bring them to the table. So there is definitely a difficult moral line that you walk. In terms of the other parties, I mean, Seamus Mallon in particular, the SDLP, does criticise us, saying that we undermine the moderate parties by talking to the extreme. But we did start from 1997 onwards trying to negotiate from the middle outwards. We started with the Ulster Unionist Party and we started with the SDLP. We tried to build from that. The SDLP made it clear they could not move forward without Sinn Féin. The position that John Hume had taken was that Sinn Féin had to come with them. So we were stuck. We had to have a Catholic party, therefore we had to have both, therefore we were talking to Sinn Féin. Later on, we carried on talking to David Trimble, even after he lost the elections in 2003. And Tony Blair carried on burning a candle for him, if that's the right expression for a unionist, well after he lost the election, and tried to bring him back even. He was planning to have further elections to try and bring him back, even after Paisley had won. In the end, we ended up making peace with the two extremes, with the DUP on one side and Sinn Féin on the other. There is an advantage to that, which is it's very hard for anyone to attack it from outside. It's very difficult to outflank those parties in the two extremes. And once they go into government, of course, it's much harder to stay being the extreme. It's very hard to be revolutionary if you've got to deal with water rates and grammar schools.
That was Northern Ireland, though. Is, in other areas, or generally, do you think peace is always a moral ends? Is it always something that we should seek? Or sometimes are there things we should not negotiate over?
No, there are certainly things we should not negotiate. Well, certainly things we should not concede. George W. Bush talked about negotiating with terrorists as appeasement in his speech to the Knesset in 2005. And I think that's just a misunderstanding of what appeasement was. That it wasn't necessarily a mistake to talk to Hitler and try and avoid a second cataclysmic world war. The problem was in thinking you could buy him off with a slice of Czechoslovakia. And talking to terrorists is not the same as giving in to terrorists or agreeing with terrorists. So we talked to the IRA, but we had no intention of giving them a united Ireland at the barrel of a gun. And you wouldn't talk to ISIS and give them an Islamic caliphate. You're not going to agree to what they're demanding with the gun, but there may be other things where they have legitimate grievances that you want to address, such as power sharing in Northern Ireland.
I imagine that understanding them is important as well. I mean, sometimes it must be very difficult to work out what it actually is that a terrorist group want, perhaps because they can't articulate it, or perhaps because they don't know themselves. I noticed that Audrey Cronin, who wrote How Terrorism Ends, a work which you've obviously studied because you've referred to it a few times, noted how can governments negotiate over demands they can neither understand nor satisfy. In your experience, has it usually been quite possible to define what it is a terror group wants, or is it often something they can't articulate themselves?
It's much easier for an armed group to articulate what it's against. So it's, Brits out, or in the case of the Taliban in Afghanistan, it's foreign forces out. It's fairly easy to unite people around what you're against. It's much harder to unite people around what you positively want to do. And it took a very long time for the IRA, for example, to get from being stuck with Brits out to saying, well, actually what we really want to have is power sharing, north-south bodies and things like that. It's a long journey. And that's what people, I think, fail to understand, and why, again, if you look at all these conflicts, you need to open a channel really quite early on, because there's a long educative process, an educative process for both sides, the governments as well as for the armed group. The governments need to understand what these grievances are. Why do the armed group take the steps that they do? You don't have to agree with them. In fact, you wouldn't want to agree with them, but you want to understand what it is that they're about. And for the armed groups, they have to understand a bit more about the outside world. Many of these groups live in ghettos, both physical ghettos and intellectual ghettos. They only talk to each other. They don't talk to people outside. The person who's the most extreme generally becomes the leader. And so there's a long conversation you have to go through for them to understand what the rest of the world thinks of them and what they think might really be acceptable compromises. And that's a long process. In the case of the IRA, we first opened a channel. The British government opened a channel in 1972 to the IRA that lasted more or less unchanged from then until 1993. But the negotiations only really happened in 91 to 93. So there's a long period before you get to a negotiation where you've got a sort of acclimatization.
Does that suggest to you a positive journey, though, or does that suggest, well, look, we've been talking to them really since 1972, there's a huge amount of setbacks, it takes absolutely ages, with a very small, localised problem compared to some of the terror movements today. Therefore, it was more of a fumbling 30 years than it should have been.
No. Well, most of the 30 years wasn't used for negotiating. It was used for negotiating for the ceasefire in 73, 74, which was successful in its own terms, and then used again to end the first hunger strike in 1980. But between 1980 and 1991, it wasn't used for anything. It was just there. It was kept open. The person who ran it called a bamboo pipe that he could blow down and the other side could hear it, but it wasn't actually used to negotiate. If you open a channel, what you then want to do is keep the conversation going until you can get to a successful negotiation. Academics talk about something called ripeness, which is when a negotiation is ready to succeed, but that's absolute nonsense, because it's obviously tautological, because you can't tell if a situation is ripe for success until it's actually happened. So you can only work out if a negotiation is ripe once you've succeeded in the negotiation. But there are certain conditions that you need.
I want to come on to the practicalities, such as ripeness or non-ripeness, or whether it's relevant in a second. But did you find that you liked them? For example, the IRA, your own father was hit by an IRA bullet. Your brother was on a death list. When you actually started negotiating, did you find quite amusing, engaging people with whom you could relate, or was there always a coldness there you found in yourself? You refused to shake hands at first with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, and then later regretted it. Yeah,
no, the first meeting we had with Adams and McGuinness was in, I think it was like end of October 1997. And we arranged it in a room in Stormont where there was no windows, so we couldn't be filmed through the windows, and we sheltered inside. And Alistair Campbell and I both refused to shake hands with Adams and McGuinness, sheltered the other side of the table. Tony, much more sensibly, shook them by the hand. I did regret it later, because it's a sort of
childish... It was a very awkward
childish
moment. I mean, it's a cold, difficult moment. Or...
It was a difficult moment. They could see perfectly well that we were trying to avoid shaking their hands, sheltering behind the table, so they were conscious of it. And they tried to make light of it, but no, they were conscious of it. What was interesting for me was doing the book is going through all these other conflicts. It's a recurring theme. You get this again and again. I mean, someone was talking to me about one of the Guatemalan military commanders of special forces going to meet one of the Mayan indigenous rebels who they'd been fighting for several decades, and he marched up to the Mayan tried to shake him by the hand, and the man refused to shake him by the hand, saying, "You have to forgive me, I'm going to need time to recover from only other time I've met officers like you, they've been trying to kill me in my family, so I'm not going to shake your hands for a bit." It's something that recurs again and again. Even, actually, if you go back to the negotiations in 1921, they wouldn't shake hands until the end of that process between the IRA and Lloyd George. It's something that comes up again and again, but it is, in my view, childish and a mistake.
When you meet people from terror groups now, you should shake their hand.
Yes, I would always shake their hands. I would treat them as any other human being. Yeah.
There's one bit I was fascinated to know, and what happened next to, and that's you were talking with Jerry Adams, and he turns to you and says, "The thing I like about you, Jonathan, is that you blush when you lie." And Bill Jeffrey, sitting next to you, says, "Unlike you, Jerry."
Yeah.
What did Jerry Adams say? Did he laugh? Did he look stony-faced?
Everyone
How
else,
did he take
everyone
it?
else laughed, including on his team, but I don't recall him laughing. No. But no, we then carried on for another 2 hours, and we made a bit of progress. But no.
Does he laugh much, Jerry?
Oh yes, no. He's a big tree hugger. He loves trees. No, you're right. I mean, you asked the question about do you get on. There's an interesting question which I try and touch on in the book, which is, do you become friends with these terrorists that you're negotiating with? And there is a danger of a sort of Stockholm syndrome. You do find people. I've seen people, mediators who, or even government people negotiating with armed groups who get too pally, too close, and they actually find themselves being manipulated, and particularly if they're mediators seeing the side of the underdog. And you need to be on good relations, but you don't want to be too friendly. Yair Hirschfeld, who is the Israeli academic who negotiated Oslo, said that he never wanted to be friends with Abu Abbas and his other opposite numbers because they had different worldview. He didn't want to be their friend, but he did want to be completely trustworthy with them. So on one occasion, Rabin told him not to go back to the negotiation, to stay away because something the PLO had done, and he insisted on going back despite the instruction because he wanted to be absolutely clear that if he gave his word, he would be there as he said he would. So there is a distinction you have to make. I mean, I used to think that it'd be much more fun to go to a dinner party with Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness than David Trimble and Ian Paisley. But you had to remember which of them had killed more people and not sort of just put them on an unequal basis because of their charmingness.
To go into the practicalities of it, how do you work out the timing then? You said you don't agree with what academics say about rightness.
Yeah.
You think it's a false distinction. Therefore, do you think that the time is always right? Because
the time is always right, in my view, to try. You should always see if you can get a negotiation going, but it won't always work. And there are two factors that seem to me that are fundamental, looking back at, again, all these examples over the last 30 and actually longer years. Negotiations only seem to work, but you can, in my view, only tell this afterwards, if you have a mutually hurting stalemate. So that's not just a stalemate. So I went to Libya in April and I thought, oh goody, there's a stalemate, militarily we'll make progress. What I hadn't observed was it was not a mutually hurting stalemate. Both sides could not win, but they could make a few more gains at the edges, they could do this and that. So a mutually hurting stalemate means when both sides really understand that they can't progress by military means. So to take Northern Ireland again, Adams and McGuinness were quite young when they joined the Republican movement. By the mid-80s, they were well past fighting age, and they no longer believed they could win. They knew they couldn't be defeated. The British Army had long since concluded they could contain the IRA, but could not ever defeat them militarily. And Adams and McGuinness reached that conclusion about the mid-1980s. That's when they started reaching out to John Hume, and then to the Irish government, and eventually to the British government. So you need to have in place that mutually hurting stalemate. Both sides need to see that it's there, and it doesn't always stay there. In Sri Lanka, there was a mutually hurting stalemate when the talks started between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil Tigers. But then Commander Karuna from the Colonel Karuna from the east of Sri Lanka defected with his fighters, and the balance changed. It was no longer a mutually hurting stalemate. The government thought it could win militarily. So even when you have a mutually hurting stalemate to succeed, it may not stay there. The other factor is leadership. You have to have.
but I can think, if you think 1972 when Willie Whitelaw met with the IRA, that seemed not to be a good thing to do in hindsight. It was apparent to both sides that there was nothing really they felt they could negotiate about at the time.
Yeah.
There was an immediate escalation in violence afterwards, and the Unionists were furious when they found out that it happened at all.
Yeah.
Doesn't that prove that there is often a bad time to do it?
No, I think it proves there's a bad time to try and do it in public. I mean, the trouble with the meeting with Willie Whitelaw in Cheney Place was that they did it in public. I mean, they didn't mean to do it in public, and the IRA didn't know they were not supposed to make it public. Quite interestingly, afterwards, they just, even though all the arrangements for it were quite covert, McGuinness writes about never having been in such a fancy car in his life, and as he was brought in from into London in, and they were rather amazed by it. They were young people, but the mistake. They certainly, if either side thought they were going to be able to reach an agreement there, they were sadly mistaken, because there'd been no proper preparation for it, and the IRA demanded the Brits leave and thought that somehow they were going to agree to it, and Whitelaw was very clear that he wasn't going to agree to that. But if that had just been a private meeting, I don't think that would have made any difference to anything. It'd been worth trying to get to a settlement. But because it became public, it spooked the Unionists and then set back any chance of talking to Republicans for a very, very long period of time, because governments didn't want to be found out doing it again. The spike of violence afterwards was because Whitelaw had been very clear that he was not going to surrender to the IRA. That was the Bloody Friday.
If you delay it for too long, you can easily say, well, look, we've cost more lives than we should have done by delaying talks.
Yeah.
But conversely, it seems that as easy, though, as in the Whitelaw example, that if you bring things forward prematurely, you can also cost lives. It doesn't seem to be a definitive rule one way or another.
But that's my point. That's why you have to keep trying until you know you've reached the right moment. You won't succeed until you've reached the right moment, but you have to try, because you can't know whether or not you are at the right moment. But I don't accept.
So, there's quite a gamble there, Jonathan, rather than a rule. I mean, it's very difficult to tell what the right moment is.
But if you try to see, exactly, that's my point. Because you sit around waiting for the right moment, you may miss it. As I say, you may get your mutually hurting stalemate, and then it may be past you before you've negotiated. So there isn't a rule. So the principle, in my view, is that what you want to do is you want to open a channel. You try and get it to negotiations as fast as you can, but it may take you, and probably will take you, a very long time. And by the way, even when you get to the negotiation, it may not succeed the first or even the second time. In Northern Ireland, we had Seamus Mallon called the Good Friday Agreement Sunningdale for slow learners, because we had Sunningdale in '73 with almost exactly the same provisions on power sharing as the Good Friday Agreement. We had the Anglo-Irish Agreement in '85, and we'd had the Downing Street Declaration in '93. All three failed. But you didn't have the Good Friday out of nothing. It was built on those three previous failures. And again, if you look at conflicts elsewhere in the world, from El Salvador to the Philippines, they're again built on failures in the past.
Do you have a set of principles which work every time when you're working out what you can negotiate over, in order to prevent yourself starting to negotiate over things which are irreconcilable and inappropriate to even begin negotiating over? Or is there one size fits all, or do you work that out as you go along? In Ireland, I guess you had Senator Mitchell's.
Yeah, there's no model to suggest there's sort of, I don't know, Northern Ireland model or some other model you can plonk down in another country would be ludicrous. There isn't any such thing. But what's interesting for me, anyway, going through all these other conflicts all around the world, is there are patterns that appear, that there are things that work, things that don't work, things that always go wrong. I mean, things like a deadline. Yeah, if you set a deadline, that can be very effective. We set a deadline for concluding the Good Friday Agreement 1 year after we came into government, and it worked because we stuck to it. Thereafter, we had a whole series of deadlines from '98 onwards, none of which we stuck to, none of which had any consequences, none of which worked. In El Salvador, they had the deadline of Pérez de Cuellar retiring, so they reached agreement on midnight on the 31st of December, the year that he retired, because they knew they couldn't go beyond that date. So there are some things that work, but have and some things that don't, and you have to learn that from your experience. But in terms of what you're prepared to negotiate, no, you have to have a very clear sense in your own mind of what would be appropriate to negotiate and what wouldn't. I mean, giving it into a united Ireland against the wishes of majority of people of Northern Ireland would not. We had the clear principle of consent that we stuck to throughout the negotiations, and in the end, Sinn Féin accepted it.
But in general terms, principles vary from place to place, group to group.
The substance of what you're trying to negotiate, I would not wish the D'Hondt principle on any other negotiator anywhere in the world, which is how they choose governments in Northern Ireland. So obviously the substance will always be different. The conflict is different, the causes are different, the agreement will be different. What I'm talking about is the process of getting from the conflict into a negotiated settlement, and actually beyond that, because the settlement itself is not the end.
Jonathan, one thing that struck me, reading Audrey Cronin's a sample she did, it's a very famous lady who studied terrorism and how terrorism ends. In a study she did about 3 or 4 years ago, of about 460 different terrorist campaigns, she found that only 18% went to negotiation, to meaningful negotiation, 18%. And of those, 9% returned quickly to violence, and less than half of the remaining 9% got where they needed to go with negotiation. Does that sound credible, those statistics to you? And if it is so, it points to negotiation talks, parley, having an appalling success rate.
But obviously, I've looked at her list of groups, and then there's another one, a similar one by Rand Corporation, that's rather longer. But that's, again, I write about it in the book. If you look at those lists, they are really comparing apples and oranges. They take tiny groups like Action Direct in France and compare those with the ANC. That's not the same thing. And they also get things wrong. Many of the groups they talk about having been ended by police work is absolute nonsense. They haven't been. They're still there. Like I think she lists UDA as being finished by police work. It's still there. And then she muddles up two groups. She suggests the FARC and the ELN in Colombia formed a joint negotiating team at one stage, and she lists that as being ended by police work. Well, it was ended when the alliance between them stopped and they carried on fighting as two separate groups. So, but my main point is I don't think really the quantitative approach is very helpful because these groups are so different.
So your attitude is you should always try and see where you go with it from there.
Yeah, I just think the ripeness thing doesn't help you at all. Thinking there's an alternative to looking at these conflicts I've studied of the big armed groups with major political support doesn't seem to lend credence to the possibility of any other way of ending them than that. And therefore I think that's why we keep coming back to it. We always say we won't talk to them, and yet we always do.
Which brings me to Islamic State. They are, as you define it and others define it, a fourth-generation terrorist group. Aren't they beyond the pale? Isn't their struggle completely different to some of the fights over national liberation and Marxism and all the rest of it have gone before?
Well, yes, of course, they're completely different. And that's the funny thing about it. Every time we meet a new terrorist group, we forget anything that happened to one before and say, oh, it's completely different. So when I left government in 2007, I gave an interview to The Guardian in which I said, on the basis of my experience in Ireland, I thought we should be talking to Hamas, to the Taliban and to Al-Qaeda. And not surprisingly, the Foreign Office said that this was completely ridiculous, and although it was okay to talk to the PLO and the IRA, it would not be right to talk to these three groups. In the 6 years since then, the Israeli government and the American government have negotiated a ceasefire with Hamas, and the Israeli government have negotiated the release of Corporal Shalit. The American government have negotiated the release of Sergeant Bergdahl with the Taliban and had other talks with the Taliban. And Eliza Manning-Buller, the former head of MI5, has said we should be talking to Al-Qaeda. So if that much can change in 6 years, why not, in 6 years' time, will we not think it's sensible to talk to ISIS?
But with that vision of overthrowing the world order as we would understand it, replacing it with a caliphate or replacing many areas of the world rule with a caliphate, don't you think that therefore becomes instantly a non-negotiable demand? I mean, it's quite difficult to negotiate with God.
No, I'm not saying... Well, if you take the God bit first, that's the line people sometimes take, that you shouldn't negotiate with an Islamic group. But that's clearly wrong, because we've negotiated with the GAM and with the MILF in the Philippines and Indonesia.
Yeah, but they didn't want to overthrow the sort of international structures across the world.
No, they wanted to overthrow them in Indonesia and the Philippines, but we negotiated with them, they were Islamic, and it succeeded. In terms of a caliphate, no one's going to be negotiating an Islamic caliphate with ISIS. Nor, by the way, am I suggesting for 1 second you should try and sit down and negotiate with them now. I'm saying you should open a channel, and then, as I've said, you try, once you've got a channel, gradually to advance in that direction. But I do think ISIS at least feed on some very legitimate grievances of the Sunni minority in Iraq and the Sunni majority in Syria, who feel they've been disenfranchised, dealt with badly by sectarian regimes, particularly by the Maliki regime in Iraq, and at some stage we'll have to address those issues. And those are the sort of things you talk to them about, not about an Islamic caliphate. So I know it's a different issue, but with the IRA we were never going to talk about a united Ireland at the barrel of the gun against the wishes of a majority of the people. It was an unacceptable demand.
James Woolsey, the former CIA chief, you quote in your book as saying that rather than sit around the table, this current generation of Islamist terrorists want to destroy the table and everyone sitting at it. Mm-hmm. Do you think he's essentially wrong in that case?
Yeah, I do think when people, and it's quite other interesting work I quote in the book, particularly by some academics, about this notion that all these groups are simply nihilistic. And actually, they're not nihilistic. If you take Al-Qaeda, when they break into franchises in individual countries, they are not simply there for destruction. They are, like other groups, trying to raise issues, trying to pursue power. I mean, they're using, in my view, illegitimate means to do it, but they are not simply nihilistic for destruction's sake. It's like the way people try and dismiss all terrorist groups as psychopaths. And actually, there's no evidence there are more psychopaths in a terrorist group than there are in Gordon Brown's cabinet.
I'm not sure about that.
Well, he may be worse than Gordon's cabinet, it's true.
So when the IS spokesman came out with quite a nice turn of phrase recently, if the subject matter hadn't been so grim, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani said, "Know that we have armies in Iraq and al-Sham of hungry lions whose drink is blood and whose play is carnage. You think it's just polemic?
No, I think they really want to kill and destroy things. But then so did the IRA, so did the FMLN, so do all these other groups. That's what they do. But they're not doing it simply for reasons of nihilism, would be my argument. If they did, they wouldn't have any political support. If they were simply destruction for destruction's sake.
But we had many of the same reference points, and it would be very easy, as you did, sit and have a drink with Martin McGuinness and talk about things and understand each other. I would imagine that would be a lot more difficult.
Well, having a drink would definitely be a mistake. Those people, I mean, obviously, culturally, I'm much more comfortable with someone from Ireland than I am with
it's not just culturally, it's just in terms of what they want. I mean, the IRA, you could talk across the board as to what was achievable, what was negotiable, what you couldn't agree on at that point.
Yeah. But, I mean, you know these groups much better than me, but there are points of contact you can make, not necessarily with the leaders, but with those people who are supporting them. If you take, for example, the ex-Baathists and the ex-Republican Guard, who are providing much of the muscle of ISIS in Iraq, those are people that you could talk with. People have talked with in the past to try and reach agreements. They have legitimate grievances about the way they were treated by the Iraqi government. I'm not trying to justify what they do. What I'm saying is, I think when we just say this new group is totally different, I just observe that we've said that every time we've met a terrorist group all the way back.
But in order to address those very real issues, you would have to first work on perhaps fragmenting and splitting the Islamic State a bit in order to find out who it was that you could speak to about that sort of subject, bypassing Baghdadi and some of the more radical leadership, therefore. It seems there's a sort of intermediate stage of feeling out, perhaps splitting off or splintering a delegation off from another to find out who you can communicate with.
Well, the British government tried for many decades to split the Irish Republican movement, and the Irish Republican movement itself did a pretty good job of splitting itself from the Stickies to the Provos, the INLA, and all the other splinter groups that split off it. But actually splitting in the end doesn't help you solve the problem. You actually want, if possible, a cohesive armed group, so you can lead it to peace once, not lots and lots of times. But I'm not sure you're not better off talking to the most radical person, but the most radical person may well not want to talk to you at the moment when he thinks he's going to win, he's doing a great job. I'm not suggesting talking is the answer by itself.
Until there's a position of hurting stalemate.
Until there's a mutually hurting stalemate. I mean, what happens is that when people realise they cannot win by military means, then they're inclined to move. What I'm saying about ISIS is that what we have enunciated, Western governments have enunciated, is a strategy for containing ISIS, not for defeating and destroying ISIS, which is what we say we're trying to do. If we're actually serious about dealing with the ISIS problem rather than simply containing it in a certain space, then bombing clearly isn't going to be an answer by itself. I don't think anyone thinks that. Even if we had boots on the ground, that wouldn't actually destroy the movement altogether. You might again be able to contain it in a smaller space. So we have to have a political strategy. And what I find frustrating is that politicians say they're going to defeat and destroy and then announce a policy that doesn't take you there. So why don't we have an honest and fairly open strategy that says this is going to take a long time, this is how we're going to deal with it. It will have to have political means of dealing with it as well as force.
One of the things I find very disturbing is you look at some of the previous groups, the real IRA and the Omar bombing, the Red Brigades and the killing of Aldo Moro, Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyah and the killing of the tourists in Luxor. These were excesses of bloodshed, mistakes or miscalculations, which cost those terrorist groups. They self-undermined. And yet, with IS, nothing they have done in terms of bloodshed, which they relish, seems to have undermined them. They actually seem to be attracting and garnering greater power and more recruits through their barbarity. Do you think that marks some sort of shift? Is it something you've seen before, or is it something that troubles you?
Well, it's certainly something we've seen before historically. If you think of the Russian nihilists, they desired to kill as many people as they possibly could. They were looking for mass casualties, tens of thousands if they could get them. Technology denied them the ability to do it. So it's not unusual to want to go for mass violence and to want to be as terrifying as you can. I mean, the point of terror, that's what people get confused about Boko Haram. They say, well, why on earth did Boko Haram kidnap 300 girls? They must have known it would upset the West about that. They want to be noticed. The reason they do this, the reason they do terrible things, they were delighted. They had burnt 100 schoolboys to death in a dormitory. They got no publicity for that at all. They'd killed hundreds of people, thousands of people with no publicity. Suddenly, by kidnapping 300 girls, they got attention. What did they do? They immediately went out and kidnapped more girls. They thought they were onto something that would get attention. The point about terrorism is that it's armed propaganda. What they want is the attention. And we sort of fool ourselves that somehow mean to upset us in this way. That's exactly what they mean to do.
I've got a few more things I want to bring up with you, but first of all, let's take some questions. With questions, if you could give yourself some introduction at least, and if you've got two questions, just ask one, and I'll come back to you if you've got a second.
I'm David Loyd. I'm a correspondent with the BBC. Hello, Jonathan. I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
I mean, I think among the journalists in this room, you would find almost nobody who would disagree with you. I mean, we've all talked to Hamas, Hezbollah, the IRA, etc., because it's fun and interesting not to make peace. And it's very interesting. One thing from your book that very often it's a journalist who's the first intermediary. I noticed in the 1920 Ireland talks.
Yeah.
My question is, you talk about the need for an open strategy with ISIS, but thinking about the way you describe it, actually maybe an open strategy is the worst thing. I mean, I've been following, because I follow Afghanistan closely, the Taliban talks over the years, and the worst thing that happened was that everybody seemed to know when the Americans were going to Doha. There wasn't, the secret channel you describe, and that actually deniability on the part of governments is probably quite a good thing, and the secret channels need to happen at the same time.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I misspoke when I talked about an open strategy. What I would really like is governments to have a coherent strategy privately, and I don't have any confidence that they do, but maybe I'm wrong because I'm not in government anymore. But you're right, it does have to begin covertly, it does have to begin, we tried in 2005 to start talking in Jordan to people associated with Al-Qaeda in Iraq to see if we could make some progress on that. So, but you want to do it privately. But what I do think is there is a danger of people thinking that the rhetorical announcements they make are going to solve the problem. I think some people may honestly believe that bombing will be enough by itself, and I hope they don't. But you're quite right to point out my slip there. Thank you.
This lady here.
Hello, my name's Sandra Kaduri. I'm a communications advisor, worked in some of these countries. Just wondering about justice. I mean, when you're coming to the negotiating table, for example, ISIL, say you are with them, what do you do about the issue of bringing justice for some of the atrocities that have been committed? I mean, there can't be blanket amnesties. So what would you suggest happens there?
You're absolutely right. There's a huge subject, the balance of peace versus justice. In Northern Ireland, we let people go who'd murdered people only 2 years after they'd murdered them as part of the peace deal. We had to do that. That was the only way we were going to get to a peace deal. And you see similar amnesties elsewhere in the world as part of these agreements. That's no longer possible now that the ICC has been formed. And so, interestingly, the first test of this will be in Colombia. If they get to an agreement with the FARC, that will be the first time you've really faced this conundrum between peace and justice. Because people expect people who've committed the sort of atrocities the FARC have committed to do 30 years in jail. But do we really think the leaders of the FARC are going to sign an agreement that involves them going to jail for 30 years? No. And we have a responsibility to future victims, not just to the past victims. It's not just the people who've already died who need to have justice. It's also we want to spare the lives of those who will die in the future. So it's a very difficult equation. Of course, the South Africans found a solution of a sort with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But in South Africa now, people would contest that as being the right thing to do. You'll find people on one side who say it wasn't true justice, our people were killed and we never got the justice that we deserved. And on the other side, I spoke to F.W. de Klerk about it, and he said it was the justice of the victors. There was nothing for the National Party, nothing for the whites in it, and it actually made things worse rather than made things better. In Northern Ireland, we tried to... when we left government, we set up a commission that was supposed to take people's views under Archbishop Eames and Dennis Bradley from Derry to look at how you could have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Both sides in Northern Ireland said they didn't want one. They didn't want to have that. They'd rather have the past still hanging out there and people like Jerry Adams being arrested from time to time, or the problem on the OTRs, or whatever it is. But actually, you do need to find a way to get, as you point out, between that balance between justice and peace. But it's a very, very hard one to strike.
Jonathan, what's our responsibility to hostages held by terror groups? I mean, hostage taking is a symptom of terrorism. It often becomes part of a negotiated settlement, because we might regard a prisoner or a prisoner of war in the same way that an Islamic terror group might just regard a hostage. It gets embroiled with the whole thing. Yeah. What's your view on our responsibility to hostages?
Hostage negotiations are a very different skill set than the one that I have or try and aspire to have. So I don't ever deal with hostages in the work that I do now. only deal with political negotiations, because the hostage thing is so difficult. I mean, I totally understand why the British government and some other governments think it is completely wrong to pay ransoms or to negotiate with hostage takers, because if you do so, you encourage further hostage taking, and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb has made over $3 million from hostage taking, so you're actually funding whole terrorist movements simply by paying out for hostages. But there's a sort of classic prisoner's dilemma, because for the individual concerned, you know, if it was my family, I would feel absolutely terrible unless there were negotiations happening, unless there was someone who was prepared to do what was necessary to get them free. And every time the British government tries to sign up other governments, as it did at the G8 in Northern Ireland the year before last, it doesn't stick. People don't actually do that. There are still other European governments paying ransoms to get hostages back. So I think there's a horrible conundrum that if you pay ransoms, if you do negotiate with hostage takers, you tend to encourage them more, but if you don't, your own loved one, your own national, is going to be the one that loses. There's a sort of, not exactly a related point, but there's an interesting thing that happens in hostage negotiations, because in New York, the New York Police Department, until about 10 years ago, used to turn up to a hostage situation with a SWAT team, and I think it's in 7 cases out of 8 the hostage would die. Now they turn up with a psychiatrist, and 7 cases out of 8 the hostage survives. So there is a case for negotiation, but it's a different skill than what I have.
How did you feel, for example, about the American Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, who was released this year in exchange for the release to mid-ground of 5 Taliban commanders? I mean, did you think that was a hostage case, or did you regard it as part of a step in a negotiation phase?
Well, it could of course be both, but it was in that case just a hostage exchange, because it didn't, or hasn't so far, led on to any, as far as I'm aware, any full political negotiations. Originally, the whole issue about the Taliban prisoners, even before Sergeant Bo Bergdahl was taken, was supposed to be a precondition for starting political negotiations between the Americans and the Taliban. But then they never got to that. Then when Bo Bergdahl was taken, they got to that exchange. So it ended up being simply as far as I'm aware, a hostage exchange rather than leading into a political negotiation. And the president was very criticised by Republican senators who said it was breaking the traditional American policy of never talking to terrorists, forgetting that Presidents Nixon, Reagan and George W. Bush all negotiated with terrorists.
But do you think they gave too much away in the release of those 5 without...
well, you could compare it with Israeli negotiations where you get several hundred per prisoner release, so I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Some more questions. Gentleman at the back there.
Hi, I'm Owen. I'm a teacher. Sorry, I know this question's been touched on a few times already, but generally needs things explained twice to me. You've talked particularly about arbitering in conflicts, and I suppose ever-changing conflicts. But I suppose some of the terrorist groups you've talked about, you've talked very much there's a political game to be played, even if it's a case of sort of pin the tail of the donkey in terms of working out exactly what people's objectives might be. But given that, I suppose, sort of more new terrorists tend to have far more mixed objectives, from jihadi, you mentioned nihilistic, sort of a caliphate, to removing apostate leaders. Given there's such a variety of goals, where do you start?
Well, you tend to start with, what happens historically in negotiations, you tend to start with transactional issues. So, for example, with Al-Qaeda, it's easier to talk to the franchises than to talk to Al-Qaeda Central. You want to start negotiating with Al-Shabaab about things specifically in Somalia, or Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb about specific issues they have, because it's always easier to start with a transactional issue that then leads you on to a grand political discussion. Although there are those who argue that you should start with the very difficult issues. So in the case of Aceh in Indonesia, the first negotiations, it was conducted by an NGO I used to work with in Switzerland called the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue. They started off trying to do the easy issues with a group that you would regard as probably as a 4th generation terrorist group, GAM. And the negotiations started about a humanitarian pause and then various issues to do recognition. And in the end, that fell apart because they started with the easy issues. President Natasari took over the negotiations after the tsunami and managed to start with the difficult issues, the issue of independence for Aceh and its relationship with the Indonesian government. And it succeeded that way by starting with the hard issues. But I'm not sure I would say that the way you approach it is necessarily any different with the new groups than the old groups. It's however diverse their aims are, what you want to think about are what their interests are. Why are they doing this, rather than what they say their aims are? Because that's what you'll need to deal with in the end, rather than what their proximate aims are, why they are in arms, what their interests of the group they represent are.
This gentleman here in the white shirt in the second row.
G'day, mate. So you're putting forward the argument that we should be negotiating with all the extremist groups that have at least a modicum of support and some legitimate focus. Do you think that with these movements there's a line that once it's been crossed we can no longer negotiate, or do you think as long as they still have some public support, that all options are therefore open?
Well, what I'm arguing is that no group is beyond the pale, whatever they've done, if they have, and there is a need to talk to them if they have significant political support, because otherwise you're not going to solve the problem. I mean, Hugh Orde, who was the Chief Constable in Northern Ireland at the time of the end of the Troubles and peace process, says, and I think correctly, there's no example anywhere in the world of a terrorist problem being policed out. In the end, you need to talk to these groups, and I think he's right, and he deals with the Sri Lankan example. So what I'm arguing is that. So whatever they do, in the end, you're going to have to talk to them. You don't want to. What you want to avoid is perverse incentives. I remember negotiating with an ETA guy at one stage who said that he was going to pile bodies on the table to increase his negotiating leverage. You don't want to find by tactical mistake that you're giving people incentive to do that sort of thing. But that in itself is not an argument against dealing with these groups as long as you handle it in a sensible way. And my argument is we should try and learn from what's gone before, because every time we approach a new group, we end up reinventing the wheel and no possible experience of what's happened before. And that's what I'm asking, is people have some memory of what went before.
Jonathan, you're also saying, though, that fighting very much has a part of negotiations. Mm-hmm. You don't want a terrorist group to have a sense that it is winning, or it will not negotiate.
Yeah. I mean, General Petraeus and a team revised the counterinsurgency manual of the US Army and Marines twice after the experience of Iraq and of Afghanistan. And they changed it from saying, well, you could just beat them by fighting, to saying you have to beat them by fighting and dealing with the community that they come from, the lessons that the British Army learnt from Malaya with the work of Templar and Harry Briggs there, where they decided that you couldn't just beat it by force, you had to get the communities, separate the communities from the guerrillas and deal with it that way. In the case of Petraeus, he said that what you need to do is move on then to reconciliation, by which he meant separating off little bits of armed groups. So with the Taliban trying to split off individual units or even individuals, or buy them off. What I'm saying is that those two things are certainly what you'd need to have in a counter-terrorism strategy, but if you don't have the third bit, which is talking to them, you won't succeed. If you simply have the military pressure down, they will fight to the death. You have to have the military pressure down and offer them a political way out, and then they may take the political way out if you have that combination. But using one without the other, in my view, won't work.
Oh, hello, I'm over here.
Hello.
Hello, my name is Antoinette. I don't do anything interesting, but I would hope to be communications director of the White House one day.
Oh, good luck.
And
You'll enjoy that.
Thanks. So my question is, you mentioned opening the channel of communication with groups. And so I wondered how you go about that mechanically. Like, do you send them an email or a carrier pigeon, or, and then by extension, how has the speed of communication today changed your job? Because you've got like breaking news on TV, you've got everything on the internet. Do these terror groups, knowing the impact that they're producing, does it take longer to get to the point where you can negotiate with them, or is it faster? Thank you.
Well, on the first point, yeah, you do literally send an email. So I had some colleagues who were working with the Nepalese Maoists. Francesca may remember this. They had no idea how to get in touch with them, but they knew they had a website called shiningpath.com because they were admirers of the Peruvian guerrillas. So they sent an email to it and were amazed to get a reply, and then eventually set up a meeting in Delhi where they were picked up in a rickshaw and driven on little streets and taken to an unfinished building and had their meeting. In the case of the GAM in Indonesia, they knew that the leader of the movement lived in Stockholm, but they had no other details. and they knew his name, so they rang up every person with that name in the Stockholm telephone directory till they got the person who then welcomed them to do it. So yeah, you do literally, you can sometimes try the obvious means and they work to make contact with them. The speed of communication, the speed of news does change things. I mean, again, we're dealing in Libya at the moment, and so there was a bombing yesterday of an airport by one side, and that immediately leads to a huge furore on social media that then drives the political actors on the other side. So it does speed everything up, and the way social media affects it changes it, but doesn't actually change its nature. It changes the way these things happen. Clearly, globalization and technology change these things. But interestingly, there's a study by that wonderful historian of the First World War, whose name I've forgotten, from Oxford, woman, talked about Versailles, Margaret Macmillan, who talks about exactly the same thing happening after the First World War. There was a similar burst of globalization of railways, steamships, telegraphs, and it had the same effect on terrorism. It spread it, so anarchists were blowing up bombs in Chicago at the same time as they were in Milan, and so you had the same sort of connection. But it doesn't actually change it, because the arms race just goes on like this in terms of armed groups. It changes the speed of it, as you say, but not the nature of it.
So can I ask you about where you think we'd be now if there wasn't...
Please, can you introduce yourself?
Sorry. I'm Nick London, I'm a documentary maker.
Yeah.
Where do you think we'd be now if there wasn't peace with Ireland?
I guess more people would be dead. The nature of the fighting would have changed more, because the army and the police would have developed new tactics of dealing with the sort of fighting, and they would have developed new ways of countering it. And I think we'd still be in the same ghastly mess going on, probably.
But by 97, I mean, the IRA militarily was largely a spent force, wasn't it?
Well, that's, I mean, some soldiers here who have first-hand experience of it, who could probably speak to this better than me, but no, they weren't. I mean, they were penetrated. They were finding it more and more difficult to get people to fight. They could see their sons, nephews, nieces getting into the same sort of trouble, but they weren't defeated. And the same is true of ETA, that the Spanish government would like to think that ETA was defeated by French security action, arresting groups of leaders after groups of leaders. But actually these groups can keep going in those circumstances. And there is a revisionist school of history that argues, both in the case of Ireland and in the case of Spain, that they were so nearly defeated that it was a terrible mistake to talk to them. Actually, if only the politicians had stood back and allowed the military and police to go ahead with it, they would have been able to finish them off. But Eliza Manning Buller and Hugh Ward have both said categorically that that would not have been possible. That, of course, the point of intelligence and the point of the military pressure is to put the people in a stage where they can negotiate and where they will negotiate. But to think you can just do it by military means is absolutely not the case in Northern Ireland, having had first-hand experience of that, and not the case in Spain, having had first-hand experience of that either.
At the back.
Hi, Christina Lamb from the Sunday Times. Hi. You talked about General Petraeus and the Afghan Taliban. And I wondered how you balance, when you're fighting, you're in the middle of a war, and you also want to talk to the group. So you had people, Western leaders, wanting to talk to the Afghan Taliban, but at the same time you had people on the ground killing off the leaders of the Taliban.
Yeah.
And you ended up actually with far more radical people replacing them, who are actually harder to talk to.
Yep, no, I mean, that's a very good point. I mean, again, to take the Colombian example, one of the reasons the FARC went into talks in the end was the Colombians succeeded in killing different paramount leaders, and they eventually killed Alfonso Cano, who they'd been hunting for a very long time, who lived in the cloud jungle and was very hard to get to. And they thought, when they killed him, that he was actually a very radical leader who was stopping talks happening. But then it became apparent when they captured his computer and the rest of it that in fact he was a moderate who'd been proposing talks the whole time. So there is a real problem. You end up killing the moderate leaders who you want to talk. And I think you're absolutely right in the case of the Taliban. You're ending up with much younger, much more radical people who are less inclined to talk. On the other hand, you can't just stop fighting or necessarily choose who you're going to kill. So that's why it's always better, if you can, to get to a ceasefire. But sometimes people argue, as in Colombia, you want to keep the military pressure on the group to make sure they'll carry on talking, because the experience of giving the FARC a pass in 1999 and giving them a demilitarized zone the size of Switzerland was they simply abused that to strengthen themselves, to increase their drugs trade and make more money. So the argument was you have to keep the fighting, but if you do, then you face the problem you described with the Taliban.
Presumably, though, I mean, there is another side to that as well. In 2007, the British in Basra dealt with, I can't remember his first name, Al-Fartuzi, one of their prisoners, who said, look, I can deliver you quietness and light in Basra if you release 120 guys from Jaish al-Mahdi and withdraw to the limits of the city. I mean, it was quite a high-level negotiation. It ended up with British troops thinking they were doing the right thing, or being told to do something which by people they thought was the right thing, which was to get out of Basra. Only then did they realise that, in fact, most people in Basra did not like Jaish al-Mahdi at all and wanted Jaish al-Mahdi to go, a job which was then done by the Americans and the Iraqi army, which cost the British a huge amount of prestige and didn't solve anything in the eyes of the local community. I think it would be very interesting in Afghanistan, once the final American soldiers go, although we hear they're being extended a bit, to see what happens with the Taliban. Now that the foreigners have gone, are many of them happy with that and will put their weapons down? Or is it that they were particularly attacking the foreigners because the foreigners were an obstacle to the Taliban trying to reinstate themselves in a manner which most Afghans don't like? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet.
No, there are a lot more qualified people in this room to answer that question than me. But I do notice that they haven't refused to talk to Ghani since he's been elected in the way they refused to speak to his predecessor Karzai. So you never know whether they might change on that or not now the foreigners have gone. But I'm probably at least 10th least qualified person to speak on this here.
I'll take two more questions. At the very back.
Jonathan, you talked about
Sorry, can you
Patrick
introduce
Sanders.
yourself?
You've talked about talking to terrorists.
Yeah.
I imagine that's sometimes the easier bit of what you do. And I'm just thinking about the work you're doing in Libya at the moment, but also this applies to ISIL. Talking to other actors who've got an influence on the crisis and bringing them into line, something you haven't spoken about.
Yeah.
Is that do you need to do that as a precondition before you can talk to the terrorists, or do you just talk to terrorists regardless?
Very, very good question. Certainly it helps an awful lot if safe haven is removed. So when ETA could no longer rely on safe haven in France to attack Spain, it made life much more difficult for them and therefore must have inclined them more towards a negotiation. In the case of the FARC in Colombia, as long as they had safe haven in Venezuela and there was no pressure on them from the Venezuelan government, it was easier for them to survive and harder for them to talk. Interesting, there is a phenomenon, this is sort of a side issue, but there's a phenomenon when people have really life-changing events or the threat of death, they can change their attitudes very quickly. It happened with Ian Paisley in Northern Ireland when he nearly died in 2004. When he came back from hospital, he told us he'd had a close encounter with his maker and wanted to end up as Dr. Yes rather than Dr. No. And then he spent the next 5 years really pushing to try and get to 4 years, trying to get to a peace agreement. The same thing happened with Chavez. When Chavez got cancer, he not only started going to church twice a day, but he also started being helpful on the peace process. He made life really difficult for the FARC if they didn't participate in talks. So having the neighbouring power or the power that has an influence on them back off is hugely important, because otherwise they can, of course, continue forever. And in conflicts like Libya, that's true when people are trying to fight surrogate wars. It makes life very, very difficult to end the fighting. So dealing with those other countries or other powers is not going to solve the problem, but you may not be able to solve the problem without dealing with them, if you think of it that way around.
Take one more question. This lady here.
Hi, I'm Courtney Finger.
Courtney, there's a microphone for you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Courtney Finger. Very interesting talk. Thank you. I run an international business magazine, but last year I toured the Maze prison. And as you probably know, this question's more about what happens after the conflict ends and how society moves on. So there's controversy about what to do with the Maze prison, with some people thinking if you leave it as it is and open it to visitors, it's like a monument to terrorism, and it almost glorifies some of the actions of the people who were in prison there. Other people think it's important for healing. As somebody who's close to that conflict, what's your opinion on that?
That became a subject of great political controversy in Northern Ireland, and having worked to make that happen between the Unionists and the Republicans, it fell apart at the last minute with the DUP pulling away from it. But I think it illustrates a bigger problem, and that is that you don't make peace by signing a piece of paper. You actually have an agreement because the two sides don't trust each other, and then you start to trust each other once they start implementing the agreement, and that can take a very long time. In the case of the Good Friday Agreement, we signed it in 1998, but it wasn't implemented till 2007. I think the Oslo Accords, they were signed, but then no one did anything about implementing them, so they weren't. They were never put into practice, and eventually led to Second Intifada. So the bit that people call peacemaking is actually much harder than the bit that people. Did I got the right way around? Yes, peace building rather than peacemaking is the bit that's is really difficult. If you look at Belfast, when we signed the Good Friday Agreement, there were 14 peace walls separating Protestants and Catholics. There are now 84. So you don't solve all of the problems just by signing an agreement. And a problem like sectarianism, which is why we have the walls, takes generations to solve. It can open up in a week in Bombay Street in the 60s, when it can take a very long time to close it. So you rightly point out the difficulties of peace building, which can take a very long time indeed.
I think that's one of the things I learned most from reading Jonathan's work, is that the process of negotiation and talk doesn't guarantee you solution any more than armed means guarantee you solution. But the process in itself often channels the violence into a more positive level, or a lesser, or more palliated level. I think from reading your work, I saw negotiation as more a competitive interaction of many competitive interactions in trying to deal with terrorism. And I think the key thing was, without the understanding of the terrorist constituency, we will never understand how to actually bring a conflict to a resolution. And you can only gain that understanding through the process of talk and negotiation. So I want to thank you all for coming this evening. I want to thank Millicent for organising the event as ever. And Jonathan, I want to thank you again. Thank you very much indeed for coming.
Thank you.
Jonathan's books are in the corner, and I do recommend them as a read.
Thank you very much.